Recording is on.
Hi, I'm Dave Livesby, and I'm with Jody Garnett, and we are going to talk a little bit about configuring GeoNetwork for deployments using the WAR overlay technique.
Another fireside chat. One of the central challenges, kind of engineering challenges we're looking at here, is trying to help customers that just want to purchase the community GeoNetwork, how to manage their configurations and so on in a responsible manner. Traditionally, GeoNetwork is forked and then customizations made directly on that fork. That's not really maintainable or easily maintainable over time when the customer wants to upgrade to newer releases of GeoNetwork. So what we're going to look at today is kind of the results of a long-running experiment using a technique called WAR overlay, where we're going to start with the base GeoNetwork WAR. Going to use a build technique called WAR overlay, where we start with that base image, pull in all the schema plugins that we are interested in using and unpack them into the right location, and then combine that with project-specific configuration, and then it's going to bundle everything back up into a new WAR for that specific customer or that specific website catalog.
And can you tell me what the sort of the main goals of this are and sort of what the advantages are?
So one of the advantages here is we really had to look at all the different kinds of things folks did when they made a fork of GeoNetwork. Things like making a custom skin or having manual steps where they would go in and change some of the GeoNetwork settings so that their user interface skin would work, or manually unzipping and installing schema plugins. So we really wanted to make this kind of a prepackaged bundle that was ready to use and cut down on both the developer overhead of forking and then the installation, the careful installation procedures that would be required to use the result.
Thank you. So I do want to talk about a few ways of configuring using this infrastructure that we put together. And there's basically three main ways. Directly using the WAR overlay, which is adding or overwriting files, configuration files, and things like views, all sorts of files like that. Using the Tomcat context, which isn't really part of the WAR overlay, but it's another way of configuring system-specific configuration parameters. And also, I've added quite a few sort of more sophisticated tools. They're all very simple, but they do things like the settings, UI settings, user groups, the Thesauruses, and Schematron Criteria for turning Schematron validation files on and off. And we'll talk about each one of these in turn.
Yeah. All of those are kind of the things where you would need a careful installation procedure in order to change all of those settings.
Yeah, and just as we were going through a few projects, and as soon as we found one of these things that was necessary, I just added it in so we wouldn't have to ever do it again.
Yeah.
So the first one is the adding or overwriting files, and this is directly how the WAR overlay works. So on the left-hand side and in the middle, we see I just made a Canadian skin here with some images I found on Wikipedia. And what I did was overrode the default view, as you can see on the left here. I just added those files into the project, and it puts them into the WAR for me, and they get overlaid. So what happens is the default view that ships with GeoNetwork gets overwritten by my nice looking or put together for a specific purpose. And our UX person put this together and just changed a few things, and it looks really good. So I don't have to worry about any deployments with that. I can put this in. And the second thing on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see I'm overriding some configuration files. You can see I've overridden for example, in the middle there, the config security and config security LDAP. So I've did some LDAP configuration for this project. And I've also overridden a few of the other XML configuration files, so they were specific to this project. And one of the key things when you're doing this, as it says at the bottom, put these files in the correct location relative to the WAR, not to the GeoNetwork source. So you can see I put these things in the location they would be in the WAR, not in the source. Because what happens when GeoNetwork builds, it oftentimes moves, for example, specifically for a view, it moves it from a location in the source file into the WAR. When you're doing these WAR overlays, you have to put it in the correct location in the WAR. So it's gotcha. Once you've seen one example, it's very easy to understand.
Trying to think if I have anything to add to that. Yeah. So one file that's in the original GeoNetwork is the web XML file. That's actually in the root of the webim folder. That's the kind of the driving directions for a web application, and it sets up a series of properties and other settings, which the administrator of the application server, Tomcat in this case, can override. So we've got an example here of how to override these web XML settings. And this is where you want to put all the information that's specific to a given installation. So you want to be able to deploy the same WAR both in like a test environment and in a production environment. You want to make sure that anything that's specific to the environment is available as one of these parameters here, so you can override. So in this case, you can see we've got a parameter for the GeoNetwork directory. That's an example of something that might be different between a test and a production environment. And by the same token, we've got a resource for the database that GeoNetwork is using.
Yeah, and you just put this in the Tomcat conf Catalina localhost GeoNetwork.xml. It's probably the location you're going to put that file. And this is really useful for example, you can see we're setting up the database to an Oracle database and setting the GeoNetwork directory and environment variable for the LDAP, which is password to connect to the LDAP. So I didn't want to put that in directly in the configuration files in the source code repository.
So if you actually, if you actually went into the web XML, you could see a default value for GeoNetwork dir. We're using that setting override false so that we can define it here at the application server level, and it won't use that value that is baked into the web XML. The real goal with these settings is to prevent people, as part of installation, having to like unzip the WAR, go around and edit a few files by hand. Because what happens is every time you update with a new WAR, you have to go and make those same changes each time. So it's not really sustainable or efficient.
Yeah, so I find this very, very nice for certainly for things like passwords and things like that to put them in here.
Yep.
Okay, carrying on. Now we're going to look at some ones that are a little bit more specific to GeoNetwork. So what I'm going to be showing in all these is a picture of the UI and then how I've got this so that you can basically do exactly the same thing as you do in the UI with a little configuration file. And you can see here, there's a tag that says use enhance multi-entry combiner organization selector in the UI. And then at the top of the file, the settings.json file on the right-hand side, you can see I'm defining its key, which is already defined in GeoNetwork. That's how it stores it in the database. It's a type Boolean, and the value is true. So you can see it's checkmarked. And again, for the one underneath it, it has City of David underneath it. So this is just very nice for being able to set up settings. For one organization, you may want to use the enhanced combiner organization selector. And for other ones, you may not. So you can just set it here. And one of the things that this does do is you can actually introduce new settings. So it'll actually create new settings if they're not already in the database and set their value, which is nice if you want to add new settings to be referenced in another file. Like a lot of the XSLT files can access settings, so you can create new settings to control those as well. So very, very, very simple. The next one is UI settings. So if you look at the admin page settings, user interface settings on the left, there's a huge amount of settings you can fiddle around with in there and turn them on and off and add some defaults. And on the right-hand side, you can see a very simple configuration. The configuration has a very long JSON string in it. That's an actual JSON string is stored in the database. So you could just put a default value here. So you could go look at, and I recommend here is you do 10 or 15 changes to your settings, UI settings, save them, and then just grab that resulting JSON object and stick it inside this UI settings.json, and it'll, when the system boots up, it'll put those settings in there for you. This is so you only ever have to do it once. So your UI designer will set this up, figure out all the settings they want, and then it could go into this configuration file, and then you never have to set it again.
Are you grabbing that from the database or via a REST API?
Yeah, so at the very bottom, just say you can either look in the database. There is a table in the database which has all these values in it, or you can watch the browser sending your request to and from the server to grab this giant chunk of JSON.
Okay.
And again, it's very, very simple.
Yeah. Maybe in the future we could do it so they could update just a subset of the JSON, much like you did for the previous page.
Yeah, that's this is because you can have multiple of these in a configuration. For each view, basically allows you to have a UI configuration.
Yeah.
But yeah, that would definitely be an improvement. So you can just say it's the default one, and then I'm going to set these 3 values or 10 values.
Yeah, turn off the footer or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there's user groups. So if you look on the left-hand side, the admin page, users and groups, manage groups. You can see I've added a group there at the top called David's group. And the way to do that is you just add that into the groups.json file. And you can see it's got a name, description, email, logo, website, the standard stuff you would enter in for it. So what this does when it boots up when the server boots up, it'll add this. If the group doesn't exist, it'll create it with those values. And this is what you typically use for security settings. This works really well with the LDAP. So you can pre-create all the groups that users might be a part of, and then the LDAP group settings, the group memberships that the user is a member of will get set in here. So this is just pre-creates it. It's very, very simple.
Yeah.
Sorry, you can ask a question?
I was just going to say, at what stage of application startup are these run? Did you do this like the schema plugins configuring themselves, so listening to an event?
Yeah, so there's 2 main events that these attach to. All these ones I've talked about before are on server startup.
Yeah.
The next one that we're going to talk about, which is Thesauruses, is actually earlier in the process. The Thesauruses need to be set up before the Thesaurus manager is initialized. So they happen at when the datadir is
being read.
Is set up. There's an event that the datadir is set. So
Gotcha.
These happen. And then there's some ordering around them because HSnap does its own pre-configuration of Thesauruses. So,
yeah.
And then this happens after that.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, it's very, very simple. The code is very, these are very small pieces of code to do all these things. As on the left-hand side, this is for Thesauruses, the min-page classification systems, Thesaurus. And then on the right-hand side, there's a little configuration file. And you have basically 3 actions you can do: delete, create only, and overwrite. So delete allows you to delete a thesaurus. Overwrite will overwrite a thesaurus, so you can stick new ones in it. So you can take an existing one and overwrite it with something else. And create only is similar. If a thesaurus doesn't exist, it'll create it. But if it's already there, it doesn't do anything. And that allows you to inject one at the very beginning and then allow users to use it. And then you can see in the purple there's where the thesaurus.json file is, and also sort of the recommended location for you to put all your thesaurus RDF files. And the last one is the Schematron Criteria setup. And this is a little more complicated, so you can tell by all the arrows. But in the min page, metadata and templates, validation, you will see all the schemas on the extreme left-hand side of the screen here. You can see the arrow pointing to the ISO 19139.ca.hnap. And then under that is a list of all the Schematron files. And the one that's highlighted there is the HNAP validation rules multilingual. And then on the right-hand side of that web page, you'll see that there is basically the Schematron will be executed during validation if that XPath is true, which is the count of the locale is greater than 1. So that means that, and the reason for this is it only executes the multilingual rules if it's multilingual.
Right.
But you can easily turn on and off schema files for project specific in a project specific manner. And there's two actions. You have delete and add. The delete is there mostly because there is a always accept. As you can see, it's deleting the always accept criteria, which is sort of defaulted by the system. So that gets deleted, and then I guess the add is what you can see configured there, which is if the count of the locale is greater than 1, then execute this. And you just put these things, as many as you want, in the schematron.json file. And as it starts up, it'll execute them.
Anything else we need to cover?
I think that's everything.
No punchy ending?
No punchy ending, sorry.
Okay.
But the punchy ending is that you can see that these things are kind of a little bit of a pain to put together. So every time especially when you're doing development, is that if you had to go and configure this every time you reran the server or wanted to recompile or something like that, it can be quite a hassle, especially if you're attempting to change, delete things and change the configuration to make sure it's detecting what you're doing during debugging. So this is nice, is that if your system will, when you start it up again, will be reconfigured to the correct, how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And that's really great for things like UI settings, because you don't want to sit there with a piece of paper saying, okay, go tick this and type this here and untick this and make sure this is this. That's quite a bit of work to do, and it's really easy to make mistakes. Another thing that I really like about this is we really didn't want to start forking and then maintaining multiple forks, one for each person or each organization that's using, for example, the HNAP. That's quite a bit of work, and it's really easy to make mistakes or lose commits. So this really does help make that easy. It's actually really easy to maintain multiple projects using the same schema, in this case HNAP, and it really makes a big difference.
Yeah. I guess I should also point out we're not doing anything like extremely unusual here. WAR overlay is a technique that's built into Maven for exactly this purpose. We did make some changes with the GeoNetwork community this year in order to zip up schema plugins so that we could unpack them and have a workflow like this. So all in all, I think this is like a great direction. There's a little bit of overlap with the database update scripts. I think I've seen those used before to like provide a few UI settings and so on, but I think this approach is kind of more maintainable. I'd love to see some of this kind of thing baked into core GeoNetwork so that this is less effort to maintain. But yeah, I think this is great.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Hopefully we'll have another fireside chat soon.
Okay. Well, I think you're running out of big ideas, so it'll be quick. See ya.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just have to figure out how to stop recording.